Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's New Social Environment. I'm Sophia, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today. A few quick notes before we get started. We'll be recording this meeting for the Rail archive, so if you would prefer not to be seen, please disable your camera by pressing the stop video button in the bottom left corner of your screen. We'll keep the audience on mute until question time, which will kick off about halfway through the conversation. Feel free to eat your lunch during this event. We can't hear you, and we know we have to eat now. If you'd like to take a moment to introduce yourself and where you're from in the chat, you can also drop your questions there, and then I'll be calling on people and unmuting them during the Q&A section. The Rail team will be helping out with tech if you have questions. Brooklyn Rail is in their name, and our production assistants will be typing closed captions to make our talk more accessible. Before we end, our very own Mike Tully will be reading a poem to close. And now to introduce today's host. Megan Liberty is the art book section editor at the Brooklyn Rail. She writes widely on artists' books and publishing and teaches archiving workshops for artists. She is also a 2019-2020 ICA USA and Creative Capital, the Andy Warhol Foundation's Arts Writing Workshop participant. Over to you, Megan.
Thanks so much for that nice introduction, Sophia. And thank you all for joining us. And thanks to Paul. I'm really excited to be here to talk with you. So Paul is an artist and educator based in Providence, Rhode Island. And we actually first met back in 2016 when I was organizing a program for the New York Art Book Fair about the printed page and the digital age, which feels like such a long time ago now.
Oh my goodness. Did you say 2016?
2016, yes.
Oh, wow.
I know, yeah, which was a great program, and I was so happy to get to meet Paul through that. Since then, I've been following his work, and he's done a number of projects. So I thought we'd just start by kind of giving the background on what Paul was up to when we first met, which was the Library of the Printed Web. And I just thought I'd read a quote of one of the descriptions that you used, Paul, to describe it as a way of interrogating the network by pulling digital material into an in-between place, making it weird by letting it sit somewhere that feels both digital and physical. So I thought we could just start by talking about that, the Library of the Printed Web, and what you were doing at the time that we first met.
Oh, that's great. And also, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to you, Megan, for hosting this, and also to the Brooklyn Rail for inviting me on and for being such a supportive team. So yeah, so it's great to hear that quote. I'd sort of forgotten that I had used the word weird there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually really nice to hear again. The weirdness of pulling things between different media, between different modalities, the screen and the printed page. Yeah, that project started earlier in the last decade, 2013. And, I think back then there was still, and I think maybe not so much anymore, this fascination with that duality, that sort of false binary of like the virtual world and the physical world. And so that project was really, and again, that word that from that quote, trying to interrogate that space. What does it mean when artists and all kinds of makers actually are trying to navigate these two different kinds of spaces? Should I share my screen and show some images?
Yeah. Why don't you share your screen while you're getting that set up? I think it's also interesting to be talking about Library of the Printed Web in this context when so much of what we're all doing is through a virtual experience and trying to figure out these ways of translating these previously print experiences to virtual experiences and that kind of relationship between the two.
Yeah. I think I'm just showing you from my website, the Library of the Printed Web page. And I think someone from the Rail is going to be putting links into the chat if anybody wants to go and take a look at these things. This is actually an image from right when the collection started forming. So this would have been in probably summer 2013. And it started as, it was a little bit earlier in that year because it was an invitation to go to a conference theorizing the web and show some work. And I decided rather than just show my own work, which was dealing with the printed web for the first time, at least in my own practice, that I would give it some context. So I started inviting other artists to give me work to show, and then suddenly I have this like collection of 50 items, and I thought, let me give it a name, Library of the Printed Web. So this was really the start of the project, and there was a lot of fascination with how this work had been assembled and trying to call it something and categorize it as a thing. I realized when I looked at this page earlier this morning in anticipation of this call that I was kind of horrified that I don't have any images of the works that are in the collection here on this page. So there is the Tumblr here.
Which was the original. That's kind of how I discovered it, was through this
Yeah.
Tumblr.
For several years, this Tumblr, and you can see it right here, this is the archive view of the Tumblr. This was the place where people were coming to look at these works that I was posting, and let me just find a good one here. This is like a classic example that I love to show. Clement Vala's postcards from Google Earth. This was in that original collection. And I think Clement at the time was talking about this as pausing the archive. In other words, you know, Google Earth and Google Street View, which still felt kind of new earlier in the last decade, as this gigantic archive and database of that was being visualized for us. But then when there's like a discrepancy, like you see here, you know, Google goes in and cleans these things up, and eventually they disappear. So I think Clement and many other artists who were working at the time were thinking about, you know, what happens when we print this out and we pause that archive and it becomes part of, you know, something that can be examined more slowly, you know, more carefully, and also preserved.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just want to highlight a few of the points you've already brought up, which are themes that I think we're going to touch on throughout this conversation. But this idea of collaboration, that you, rather than just presenting your own work, were drawn to collect the work of others and kind of use this collective authorship approach, as well as the idea of an archive, which I know I really wanted to kind of talk to you a little bit more about. What an archive is and what kind of absences are present in the archive, the urgency of the archive and building an archive of both digital content that becomes absent. So all these themes I feel like you're already raising just with the Library of the Printed Web, but you really bring into your later work.
Yeah, it's good to revisit this. I don't think so much about Library of the Printed Web anymore. I mean, I do, it's there, but you know, I'm more focused on things that have been going on in my practice more recently. So it's good to hear that, and it's good to think about, like, how was I already starting to collaborate? I mean, this project turned into a real publishing practice called the Printed Web, and I'll show that right here. You can see all these different issues here. So like Printed Web #1 right here, where I invited a bunch of these artists in. And this was really the first time where, and this is from, what does it say, winter 2014. Yeah, this was really the first time where I was inviting people in to the space of a publication and to really think of it as a kind of—
I love that image, because it shows that you also created this physical printed item as well as this available free PDF download.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right there.
Which is also thinking about notions of access and accessibility in publishing as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's good to see this work again. Something happened though along the way where I started realizing that a lot of these, more recently, like in the last couple of years, that a lot of these artists were their techniques of appropriation that they were using, that I was fascinated with, that a lot of us were fascinated with at the time. I started to question a lot of those techniques ethically, even. Started seeing this whole idea of grabbing and hunting for imagery, that was language I was using at the time to characterize the way these artists were working. And I started to question even that language, you know, like identifying these, could we call them settler colonialism terms, you know, like going and grabbing material or territory or things that don't belong to you and claim possession. And of course, at the time, what was fascinating about all this was that authorship seemed to be something that was just in flux and fluid in a new way with the internet. And but then that's when I think there was a real turn in my work.
Is that when you kind of turned more to these ideas of urgent craft? Do you want to talk about that now?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was the start of it.
Yeah.
Let me go back over to, the
Yeah,
talk.
what really touched me about Urgent Craft, before we get into too much of it, but just at the start, thinking about its relationship to the archive,
Mhm.
this is actually from a talk. I'm going to quote you again. This is actually from a talk you gave in January of 2019 at the Internet Archive, and you said,
You're
"We
right.
tend to think about archives as places of deep abundance, rich sites that house a multitude of perspectives. This can certainly be true, but archives are also sites of erasure, allowing some voices to be amplified while others are minimized or excluded when they don't fit into normative narratives." And I
Mm.
feel like that's also tied to this idea of shifting authorship, who gets to author an archive, who gets to author a work, who's represented by these institutional story keepers.
Yeah. Yeah, that was, it's great to bring that up as well. That was a talk that I gave at the Internet Archive when I was an artist in residence there. That was, yeah, January 19, I think. And yeah, I would say that at that moment, this was around the Trump inauguration.
Mm,
So I'm looking at a project here. I'm showing you right now. I'm sharing the screen for a talk that I gave called Urgent Craft for the Eyeo Festival last year, where I'm addressing some of the issues that you just brought up, Megan.
mhm.
This particular project, this was a zine. And I actually have it here. I don't know if anyone can also see me, but thank you for your interest in this subject. And this was really, I think, the moment where Library of the Printed Web sort of branched off into a little bit more of a political direction. And it was a
Mhm.
work that I created, that I authored. This wasn't a collaboration. And actually, I was using the Internet Archive here to go in and take a look at the White House website, whitehouse.gov, on Inauguration Day. And earlier in the day, of course, it was the Obama version of whitehouse.gov. And later in the day after 5 p.m., it was the brand new Trump whitehouse.gov. And what had happened was every page having to do with minoritized or historically marginalized people had disappeared all at once, suddenly. And in this talk, these are
I
slides.
love that image. I really love that image.
Yeah, so in this publication on the left, I have the Obama version that had been preserved in the Internet Archive as actually like a live site. These are screen grabs that I used. And then on the right-hand side, the Trump version of that same URL. So on the left, you have, you know, a whole section of the website, the White House website dealing with civil rights. On the right, thank you for your interest in this subject. And that page is just repeated again and again and again. But this is a moment for me where I started thinking about how pausing the update cycle, or
Mm.
going into the archive and looking at digital material and re-looking at it, either by taking it back out of context or printing it and putting it into a new context, could actually be a political gesture,
Yeah.
a move that is empowering or is informing in some way that otherwise might be forgotten.
And again, you're talking about this idea of speed, slowness, urgency, pausing, allowing things to develop slowly or more quickly, how you find that relationship between content that way. And
Mm-hmm.
in my understanding, it seems like Urgent Craft kind of grew out of this idea of then this question of how to make work productively during a crisis when you see things happening that are troubling, and to find ways to continue to work, which is something that we're thinking about now under this new context of COVID-19. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. So urgent craft.
yeah, maybe you should define that for us since we're
Yeah.
about to talk about it.
I don't think it really has a firm definition. I was anticipating that question from you, so
Yeah.
thinking about this. I have some notes here that I was sort of preparing this morning to think about what is that definition. And I think it's many things. It's a way of working.
Mm-hmm.
It's a set of principles. It's a kind of reminder that art and design can be used to loosen power. As someone who teaches graphic design at the Rhode Island School of Design, and as a practicing artist, I'm concerned with how we're working. in the moment, in whatever the condition happens to be or the conditions. So earlier in the decade with Library of the Printed Web, that was one kind of concern. Around this time when I made that, thank you for your interest in the subject, zine, and a little bit after when I was participating, like many, in a lot of protests outside, I took a picture of someone holding up a printed tweet, at the time Governor Mike Pence, as a kind of reminder, printing the web as a reminder. But this is not necessarily an artist doing this. This is someone who has decided this is like tactics that they need to use in order to go and protest in public space. This was really the moment when I first started thinking about this as a kind of craft. You know, and I guess that word, I mean, that's a loaded word. I would love to maybe like talk about that more in the Q&A. Like, what does that word craft mean to us or mean to people in different ways? But again, pulling it a little bit away from a formal art or design context and thinking about craft as something that is using the tools and the materials that are right in front of you to respond to a particular condition. And so this was one moment. I show this image in just about like every talk that I give. You know,
it's a great image.
Yeah, it's kind of defining of that particular moment to me. This is another version of that when Bernie brought a printed tweet to Congress, to the floor in order to talk about Medicare for all.
Yeah, and this ties into one thing, side note, when you were talking about the importance of design and graphic design and how that can participate. I was thinking a lot about here in New York. We maybe all are tuning into these press conferences where they're using these, where Andrew Cuomo and de Blasio are using these PowerPoints, and people have become really fixated on the aesthetics of these PowerPoints. And there's been a lot of conversation about kind of corporate aesthetics and how design can reinforce a certain narrative or undermine a narrative, how design can kind of calm or soothe us, or how it can agitate.
Yeah, those are all good words, agitation for sure. Exactly. I think, we can't escape art and design, but particularly as you're putting it, design, corporate design tactics and how we're surrounded by them. They're on every platform that we use. So design is political and it's ideological, just by its very nature and how it's being used today, and it surrounds us. This was another moment, this image I wanted to show around the same time. This is the Whitney Biennial in 2017. And this is Parker Bright, who is an artist, but was protesting the Dana Schutz painting by standing in front of it to block the view. And they have Black Death Spectacle handwritten on their back, on their t-shirt. This was another moment for me where I wasn't using the term urgent craft, but urgency and craft both come up here in this. I mean, a lot comes up in this image. And in the whole discourse and discussion around this image. But I was particularly interested in Parker's use of hand lettering and their body as a platform, as an act of protest, but also thinking about putting a message in public space as an act of protest. Is that an act of publishing in a way? And that's when I started thinking about, how we can use visibility or not being visible in public space as a form of agitation. In this case, blocking the view and blocking the smooth read in a space of white supremacy.
Another example that you and I have talked about in the past as well, that's related to the body and radical acts of publishing or not in public space, is the David Wojnarowicz jacket. I don't know if that's in this talk or not, or readily available for you to pull up.
I can
but I'll just quote you. You said about this: "I see it first as an act of protest, but then as a gesture of publishing, manifesting an urgent message in public space, using the very body that is the subject of that message, the body that will die of the disease, as the platform for its dissemination. This jacket is so many things. It's art, it's graphic design, it's a plea, it's a protest at a very particular moment. It's an urgent artifact." And this is from the talk he recently gave. And I recently just wrote a piece for The Rail about Wojnarowicz and his zine from 1989. So I've just been thinking a lot about these kinds of radical acts of publishing, about disease, about how to draw attention to these things, how publishing can give voice to these communities.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, yeah, you have a great way of just sort of like bringing it all up and connecting it.
I know there's so much to unpack, but I feel like this image is extremely powerful, and I loved your description of it as a radical act of publishing and an urgent artifact. And again, what you said earlier about the fact that an urgent artifact doesn't necessarily need to be art in the traditional sense, doesn't need to be created by an artist, but it brings in all of these ways of material engagement that we've been talking about.
Yeah. Thanks again for bringing all of that up and for bringing us to this image. Yeah, I mean, this is an image from history. This is 32 years ago. And I have to be careful when I refer to this as an act of publishing or a publishing gesture, because obviously this is a person, this is an artist wearing this jacket at the time in a kind of life and death situation with their practice, with their act of protest, with, now, as we know, looking back, dying from this disease I think 4 or 5 years later. So all of that now is bound up and in this image. When I refer to it as a gesture of publishing, I'm hoping that I'm not diminishing it, but trying to connect it to a whole tradition of radical publishing that we think of more on like the printed page, and experimental publishing, putting messages in public space. And
yeah, I think really early on with your work, this kind of simple idea of publishing as making public, as something that has to engage with a public, I think is a good way of thinking about this, where hopefully, like, I really appreciate you making that comment, but hopefully it doesn't diminish the real person and what happened to him, but kind of makes that connection.
And their body of work. I'm going to skip over from this to, you referred to it, a more recent version of this talk, Urgent Craft. This is just from less than a month ago. This was a talk I gave at Otis in LA on Zoom. This was my first official Zoom talk, and I actually I put the whole talk on this page and shared it in the chat, and maybe someone is doing that here also so that you can follow along and look at the images. But here is where, in this talk, where I updated my ideas around Urgent Craft, this is really where I focus on this as an urgent artifact. And I think that sort of bridges nicely to thinking about, like, well, how do we work today? This is 32 years ago. What is the purpose or the necessity for making urgent artifacts today? What does that even mean? And so that brings us to sort of, the current condition and the current practice. And again, this is maybe too much of a leap, to go from David's jacket in this life and death situation. Well, actually, maybe not, because this is another life and death situation that we're in for many people and for many communities. But to now go to something that we more traditionally think of as experimental publishing or independent publishing in the form of a zine.
Yeah.
And all of the incredible things, gestures, objects, urgent artifacts that were being produced over the last 3 months.
I want to slow down for 1 minute and just read so that everybody else can hear this, what you wrote about, what you said in your talk about urgent artifacts, that I think will become really relevant here. Urgent artifacts aren't necessarily legible to everyone. Their strength is in their specificity, designed for certain communities while barely acknowledged by others. And I think that is essential right now to think about, is audience, who has the authority to speak, who's listening, what language are they speaking, language meaning not just verbal, but visual language, all these types of ways in which communities can communicate with each other and either be heard or be unable to be heard during these moments of urgency and crisis. Yeah,
I think that's crucial if we're talking about urgent craft, is this question of legibility and how one is. So let me clarify here. I don't think this is about, this could be easily oversimplified, that one should be legible all the time, or that one should resist legibility and make oneself illegible. But there's no easy or simple way to really think about any of those ideas, because there's privilege and there's burden bound up in every instance of making oneself visible. For instance, going back to the image of Parker Bright and what it means for, a Black person to get in the way or to agitate or to interfere, depending on that context. That form of visibility or legibility, say for an undocumented worker, is fraught, and there are no easy answers there.
And I do feel like the various contributions, I think we'll transition a little bit into talking about some of your actual more traditional thoughts about publishing. So the zines you've produced and books you've produced collectively. I think that the groupings that you've shown there, a lot of the artists and contributors have raised this very issue that you're talking about sort of this idea of ableism and how do you resist in ways that don't prioritize being able to be physically present, being able to put your body somewhere, because that can be quite dangerous and not available to every community.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why I think radical publishing, or even just talking about independent publishing and what these various modalities afford us today, especially in a time and in a moment when being physically present is mostly not possible, or is not possible in the ways that we're traditionally thinking about it. This is an interesting example, Quarantine, which was created by Mark Fisher right at the start of the crisis in Chicago, is where he's working. And he was doing these, I think he's still doing them daily. I think he's made over 50 of them. I have a set of them here. And they're just these one-sheet risograph prints that are very, very quickly put together and then put out in public space. So it is possible to physically publish in this way, in this moment. And that's right now, what I'm particularly interested in is where are these moments where we can connect that are not here on Zoom, that are not even necessarily on the screen. And I don't want to get like overly romantic about that, like, oh, we just need to, find each other in physical space. But I do think that this is a moment or a place for us to look for a particular kind of creative output that is unexpected and surprising. And as you just brought up, Megan, perhaps even crucial for particular communities or for particular people who aren't necessarily able to be visible in the traditional ways. But you mentioned the work that I'm doing, and I'm going to skip down. I hope this isn't making everybody too dizzy, but all the images are here.
I encourage you all to go to Paul's website. It's really full of so much rich material, and you can really spend time with the material. Most of the examples we're talking about are available as free download PDFs. So everything is, you can spend time reading all these contributions at your leisure. It's really great.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, these are some of the publications that I've done, and I've got them here physically, but actually, it's really good to look at these images because you're seeing them more clearly. This is the Queer.Archive.Work #2 that I did at the Internet Archive.
Yeah, maybe you could just slow down a minute and introduce Queer.Archive.Work a little bit, when you began it, what the kind of impetus of the project at its beginning was.
Yeah, so summer 2018, I was thinking about how to, I remember saying to my friend, Elisa Jardina Papa, Library of the Printed Web is over. MoMA Library had acquired it. So it was sort of gone, and I was not going to be sort of working on it in my practice in the same way. But I was really wanting to do something that would connect queerness with the building of a collection or the building of work in a more present way, not an archive as a sort of as a historical lens, but as a way of thinking about people who are currently being left out of archives, who are not going to be in the archives of the future, or not necessarily. And so that's where the idea for Queer.Archive came up, which was at first a collaborative publication where I was inviting people in to kind of make a mess with their work. And what do I mean by that? Everything was unbound in the first 3 issues. you can see this is the third one, which is from this past fall, 2019. This is at the New York Art Book Fair under the dome. And all of these risographed and print-on-demand printed documents here are different pieces that I put together, that I assembled. And I love really thinking about this as a kind of assemblage of voices. And of course, there's a long tradition of that as well, of assembling publications.
And thinking of this idea of collective authorship again.
Yeah, yeah. And also, you know, taking space, you know, what it means for a publication to become undone or unbound.
Right. I'm really interested in this idea of the unbound publication in terms of book publishing. It's a very rich concept to be an unbound publication. It has a rich tradition in many different forms of publishing, from the Dada publishing, Fluxus publishing, but now thinking about unbound as being tied to other notions of gender and sexuality and all of these ways that I actually ran into you at one of many book fairs that we end up seeing each other at, and you were selling, you had just launched Queer.Archive.Work, and you told me that it was unbound, and that's when I knew immediately that this project was going to be really exciting, because it's such a simple gesture, but when done right, can be really, really powerful. Other concepts you brought up are messy, which I love for you to unpack that, and this idea of failure and not fitting into things in the expected way.
Yeah, failure is important here. I think it's also frequently misunderstood or misread, because when I speak about failure, I'm referring directly to Jack Halberstam's Queer Art of Failure, and this idea of looking at what our conventional notions of success are, accumulative wealth, heteronormativity, reproduction, all of the things that sort of go along with capitalism and the sort of dominant ideologies of the moment. That's what we think of as success. So who is not included in that definition of success? In other words, who has been defined as a failure throughout history? And that's what's interesting to me, is to go back and look, or to identify today and now, those who are not being included in those normative narratives, those who are not being brought along in that dominant narrative of what we define as success. So in a very small way, I mean, I'm talking about a collection of zines here, but it's a small gesture, a publication like this, but I'm attempting to think big with this. In other words, how is it that this can create a space for someone to feel like their work is visible, but also not being defined in a particular way, not being put into a kind of hierarchy or into a perfect read. And that's where sort of resisting the perfection of design as an ideology is also an interesting territory that I could go on about.
Yeah.
Even the future of graphic design, like what does that mean to resist the perfect read?
Even your title kind of gives to this nuance, Queer.Archive.Work, thinking from kind of a more linguistic literary sense, those three words have so many different meanings. And when you put them all together, I think it really gets at what you're trying to say in terms of allowing people. The archive, we've already talked about, has all these heavy, weighty ideas of institutionalism and who is present and who is absent, and how are stories archived and whose stories are archived. And then queer, you've written a bit about obviously the different meanings of that, and then thinking earlier on, and then work, this idea of being productive and making something and putting in work, and also issues of labor.
Yeah, well, you just unpacked it. I mean, that's great right there. I mean, this whole project and what it's turned into, and we can also now talk about it as a place, because that's the next part of this, has been for me an incredible investigation into that word queer. You know, what queerness means. Of course, it doesn't mean one thing, but thinking about it from the perspective of queer theory and thinking about it as a kind of process of becoming and never quite attainable, a kind of rejection of the present and moving into the future in that way, and thinking about queer practices and queer methodologies. less from an identity politics perspective and more from the lens of like how we work. You know,
Yeah.
is it possible to use a queer methodology to work or to write, being aware or knowing that what you were doing is pushing back against those definitions of success that
Did you want to show some examples of some of this work before you talk about the space, or?
Yeah. Well, let's see. I mean, it's hard to show just one example in these publications because they're assemblages and so they're made up of a lot. But these, if anyone wants to look further on my website at all of these publications, the Queer.Archive.Work publications, and also the urgency readers, which we can talk about, they're filled with work that I would put into this realm of resisting the perfect read and setting out to agitate in some kind of way.
Do you want to introduce the urgency reader a little bit too, because it's part of a piece with this project?
Yeah, so I'll do that while I'm also talking about this
okay, great.
space, Queer.Archive.Work. Earlier this year, I mean, this is really recent, I decided that I wanted to somehow transform Queer.Archive.Work, the publication, into a space, and specifically into a porous space. And we can talk about that as a concept, as an idea. So I actually started a nonprofit. Queer.Archive.Work is now a 501c3. And this is the studio. I'm actually in this space right now. And you can see in my background a kind of image taken from above. It's got a few different levels of Nikki Ewan, who was an artist working in the space. I think if I move, you can see.
Yeah, we can kind of see now.
Kind of see. Anyway, but she was there and producing work the day that the whole sort of shutdown really started up here in the Northeast, which was like Saturday, March 14th. Anyway, so this space as a place to physically bring people in to use a risograph printer for free. I mean, that's the mission of the space, is that this is always accessible and free as a place for people to experiment with urgent craft, with everything that we've been talking about, with independent and experimental publishing. Yeah, there's a website for Queer.Archive.Work. Here's this image that's behind me in the Zoom. Nikki Ewan at work using the space. Here's Nora Khan, who I think is here on the call. I saw her in the waiting room, printing something from her Wild Ass Beyond zine as a kind of poster print just before the shutdown. But maybe this is a good time to talk about mutual aid publishing, which is something that, you know, right after I opened the space and then we had to shut down. And again, this is early March and everyone's in a bit of sort of panic mode about what to do. And there's a lot of fear being felt on my part about how to exist, how to live, of course, but also like how to work. How are we going to work in this condition? And is this a time to get to work? And I started thinking about, well, I can't have people coming into the space right now to work, but maybe I can be in the space printing for other people. And maybe that in a way could be a way of connecting people and creating community out of this bizarre condition that we're in. And that's where the idea for a second edition of Urgency Reader came up. And this was something that happened really quickly. I mean, the literal definition of urgent publishing, in that I put out a call on March 18th for work that was being produced during the quarantine for people to share, but as a way to there's some noise there. But the whole sort of motivation for this project was as a kind of affirmation. And I think Nora Khan was actually the one who brought that to my attention in this frenzy at the beginning of the shutdown, when we were thinking about our sudden new relationships to space, to institution, to other, and thinking about all of the forgetting probably going to happen in that moment. Nora actually created an incredible piece called A Call for Sick Speech. It's right here. There's a link to it from the talk webpage that I just showed to everyone. And really thinking about what do we need to do to affirm the situation and the conditions that people are struggling with in survival, in the way that people have always been surviving, in the way that people have always been struggling and making under the conditions of urgent craft, not simply just moment. So I started receiving so much work. I got contributions from over 100 people and decided to put it together again in an unbound. What you're seeing here spreads from this. And there's an image here. I just got to work printing everybody's pieces. There's incredible work in here. I could talk for another hour just about the actual content and work in here. It's an incredible range of serious writing, of humor, of real fear, and it becomes a kind of record of that moment. And I also decided that it was very important to pay everybody who participated, and figured out how to do that with some state funding, a grant that I had received that I then decided to redistribute to all the participants. And many of them contributed their share back into the pool. So in the end, about half, a little less than half of the people who participated ended up getting a larger amount because of this collaborative mutual aid effort that happened. So this, for me, this is sort of fresh. It just happened. It's a brand new sort of network and community of artists and writers and people who are who I'm now connected to, but who are also talking about each other's work and knowing about and aware of each other's work through a publication like this. And again, it's a small move, but one that I'm really excited about. I feel like this publication embodies a lot of what's important to me about how we work right now.
Yeah, I agree that I'm really excited also about this publication. I spent a lot of time preparing for this talk, reading again over the urgency reader issues and thinking about how, and then looking back at your old work, how a lot of the issues that come up in the urgency readers are there earlier on, like when we started by talking about Library of Printed Web and all the ways that publishing is tied to memory, archive, history. As you said earlier, there's so many great contributions. I almost feel bad calling out a few of them, but some that stood out to me, you have tiaras up right now, but I also was thinking about earlier on when I was referencing kind of one's ability to use the body and all the different ways we have to resist. I was actually thinking of the Oakley's contribution, who I saw in the chat. And they one of their phrases that I wanted to pull out was collective self-organization in this moment of collective care, and thinking about ableism and the ways in which we are reaching out to each other during this health crisis, and why we don't always reach out to each other, who needs to be reached out to, how listening can be a powerful form of resistance as well.
That's wonderful to call out. Did you say B is here?
Yeah, I thought I saw B in the chat.
I hope so.
Didn't I? Yeah, there's B.
Okay, hello B. So there are, I just wanted to let everybody know that for the Brooklyn Art Book Fair, which is coming up like in a month, less than a month, I'm going to be doing a reprint of 25 selections from the 110 in Urgency Reader 2. B's is one of them, and what you see on the screen there, Tiara Roxanne's, is another. B's piece, B, for anyone who's not aware, is the artist who is running Genderfail Press, which is absolutely incredible. It's an archive, it's a publishing force, and I have here on the table next to me a number of publications and a whole bunch from Genderfail's publication.
Yeah, I've been kind of back and forth with B a little bit, trying to figure out a way to kind of cover those publications through the art book section at the Rail as well.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah. So B's piece was titled, is titled Collective Self-Isolations, Thoughts on Radical Softness as a Boundless Form of Resistance During a Pandemic. And
great title.
Yeah, and so that's there. This entire thing is downloadable. Where do I have that? I have that someplace here. This is my site. Right here.
Yeah.
At the top, the very latest thing. So this is the urgency reader page on my site. I was very transparent with all the funding that happened. I printed a very small edition here, and actually raised $2,000 to go towards the risograph residencies that we're going to be starting up this summer, fingers crossed, here in the space.
Another one that I just wanted to reference, I don't have an image of it available now. I don't know if you'll be able to, but Anna Gardner, No Time, that image was kind of, I felt like really had to do with the speed of things and slowing down of things. I think it was just one page, right, that Anna did.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find that. Right.
That's okay.
I mean, look at all of these.
Yeah, there's so many. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, but a lot of the contributions having to do with all these same things we've been talking about, but speed especially. So it was interesting to start the talk by talking about Library of Printed Web and thinking about how that involved kind of a slowing down and a slippage and finding something in between. And again, even with the urgency reader, even when we feel this urgency to react and to do something, there is also a need to slow down and to think about this moment in between.
Yeah, again, it's like most binaries. I think it needs to be the simplification needs to be taken apart. It's not about like going really fast or just slowing everything down. But I'm really thinking a lot about how publishing like this, how an artist's practice, how a publishing practice can be an act of care. And I think communal care, thinking about care in a sort of collective sense, through the works that we make, through the works that we circulate, that's a slow, ongoing process. This idea of thinking about generosity in one's practice is not something that can be rushed or something that, these are slow moves, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
And then thinking about
having the flexibility and the resilience to respond quickly to a situation, to make connections, to help out, that involves a kind of speed as well at the same time. So I think modulating between these different speeds is something that I'm, just trying to explore.
And I think also what you wanted to talk about earlier with your physical space and being transparent about the space and then creating a space that is itself porous and able to be fluid in this way,
right? Or
not fluid or exist. I don't really know where I'm going with this, but have a physical space that can do this, be this malleable thing that we're kind of trying to get at and allow for this more nuanced, less binary experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to talk about porousness or porosity at a moment when everything's, closed up, locked up, and what that even means today. Like think about retail and institutions that are about to become porous or that are sort of opening up right now, and the hesitancy that we may or may not have to enter space, to enter public space.
One thing I've been thinking about with that is then what space is available. It makes me think a lot more about thresholds and boundaries and the kind of those delineations between space that are now so important for necessary health reasons, but also are the meeting point. Again, now it brings us back to this idea of the screen and all these physical ways that we are still able to meet, but that are still barriers and thresholds that we can't pass through in some ways.
I feel like I could go on and on, but I'm looking at the time. Should we do some?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. I mean, Sophia, what do you think? I see 58 people have chatted, or I don't know what I'm looking at.
Oh, no worries. We do have some questions. So why don't we transition into that? And as themes come up, you can continue talking.
Is that okay, Megan?
Yeah, that's great. No, that's great.
I'm just kind of curious if there are any interesting.
I've been kind of peeking, so there are some really good ones here.
I'm not looking, so.
No worries. Let's start with Juliet Cesar. Juliet.
Oh, hi, Juliet.
I'm going to unmute.
Hi, Juliet.
There we go. Okay, I'm unmuted. Hi.
Live. Hi.
Have you here in my apartment? It's awesome.
Great to see you.
I wanted to ask actually something I've been witnessing. So I know your work pretty pretty well, obviously, over the years, since we both teach at art institutions. And I mean, I think one of the things that's the most interesting for me is trying to connect this work of inclusion with, these types of forms and media that are often like very esoteric, not very accessible to people, risographs, avant-garde aesthetics, these webs of connections, like who do you know at the book fair, kind of stuff.
Right.
Like, can you talk a little bit about, because like to me it feels a little bit like it's about bringing somebody into that conversation, but then can you talk about audience, like who then is all of this for, who is reading it, who is picking it up, how do you frame that within the larger project? You've talked a lot about the author, but like what about the audience? Can you talk about that?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because that was on my list of topics I wanted to try to get to, was audience as well. So thank you, Juliet.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm really glad that we get a chance to talk about this, because that is so important to me. And it's also, I think, one of my biggest challenges and struggles as someone who's now, the gatekeeper. In other words, I'm starting a residency program. I have a space that, I'm saying is accessible, but there's a locked door in the front in the complex that I'm in that I can't quite control. So how is it that I am, how is this work accessible or not? And one thing that's very important to me that I have stated in the mission for Queer.Archive.Work, both as a publication, but now as a space, is who the space is for. And again, this is a challenge. This is going to be a struggle for me. How do I not have this be a space of whiteness, for instance, and just by nature of me being in the space, it is a space of whiteness. So I think that's challenge number one. So being able to state that priority will be given to Black, Indigenous, people of color, to disabled people, to immigrants, to people not affiliated with RISD or with Brown University here in Providence, Rhode Island. Those are things that are very important for me to say. And how that is now, as this organization grows, as people start coming in here for the residency program, how that's all enacted. Like, I want to be accountable for that. I want this organization to be held accountable for that. So that is on my mind a lot, and it's going to affect how I choose who gets to work in here, how maybe it shouldn't be me choosing that. These are all, big questions for me.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So great to see people in conversation who already know each other popping up here. It makes me feel almost like we're at a party. So next I'm going to go over to Jay Sebastian. Excuse me, Jay, if I'm saying your name wrong, feel free to introduce yourself once I unmute you. You are live.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm looking for my question, but I guess it regards like commodity, and I'm interested maybe in like, let's see, how does that play a role in like publishing, if at all, in activism?
Mm-hmm. The commodity, meaning like the object, the artifact,
right? Like like the the fetishism of like the object, I guess.
Oh, that's a great question. It's another thing. You all are like picking the things that I struggle with the most. Because, okay, that brings up a really great question. How does one critique, be aware of, resist, refuse capitalism and our, fetishization of the commodity, while at the same time participating in it, and I think it's impossible to think otherwise. It's not like you can totally remove yourself from these economies or from these systems. We all live within these structures. But I do think that we can make gestures, I think the idea of always remaining flexible and open as to what an object can be and how it circulates and who has access to it is key here. So I remember when I was doing the printed web publications, I think it was number 3, where I said it was also an open call, kind of like Urgency Reader. And I think I had 150 artists who had responded to the call and were included in this publication. And I thought, how do I print this in a way that can circulate to everybody who even just participated, regardless, you know, like not even talking about a larger audience than that. And that's when I came up with this idea that there can be multiple ways that an object, that a commodity can be accessed and circulated. So I had to create a free version. I created several free versions. There was a very cheap version that was print on demand. There was a really expensive version that I would sell to collectors to go into institutions that would become accessible in another way, but that would also generate funds to go back into the project. So I'm still operating under that framework. I think that's really important to the work that I'm doing here. Even something like the Urgency Reader that I just talked about, I encountered the same problem. I'll show you, you know, this thing ended up being massive that I printed. Oh,
yeah, we can only kind of see it.
Yeah, there. So it's this, oh, B is holding up theirs as well.
Ah, amazing.
That's great, thanks. Yeah, I only was able to print, it was just me in here, and there is a graph printer, and I only used the paper I had here in the studio. So I could only print 25 of these. So that meant that I could offer them for sale at a fairly expensive price to raise money for the residencies. So, and that money is going directly to $500 grants to the artists who are gonna come in here. But then it's also entirely downloadable for free on the website. So being able to look at a commodity in these multiple forms with multiple access points is super important. And I know B is thinking about this all the time in your work too. Many of us are. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome, thank you so much. Fong Bui has a question next. Then we have, you know, 2 or 3 more after that. So.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Megan. I just wanted to add a little bit the question just now. It's not so much that we should perceive things as precious, although they can be precious.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just commodity. I mean, that word can be very deceptive. But for example, I give you one that I can think of at the moment. There's this amazing magazine that I discovered in a yard sale in the sophomore year in college in Philadelphia. Complete, 10 issue. It's called the 7 Arts. And that was created in 1916 to 17. I memorized the content for a long time because I admire it so much. In other words, even though it lived, it's only a year, it was created by these 2 amazing editors named James Oppenheimer and Waldo Frank. And basically they met someone as a party named Annette Rankin, and she agreed to fund the magazine because she loved the premise of unify the 7 arts, just like in the Greek terms, architecture, painting, sculpture, and the rest of it, performing art and whatnot, music and so on, dance. And even though it had terrible small circulation, it got into certain people's hands. I mean, certainly part of the editors, William Phillip and Philip Ralph. So it's very interesting, just like the way that we forgot that, for example, I just mentioned in my editorial recently how Mussolini used to write for Atlante magazine. He was a socialist, and it was amazing how Atlante magazine got into a hand of several people in Europe, and not to mention Maretti. Maretti, the founder of Futurists. Party was how Mussolini learned how to adopt speed and technology, which is what Futurism was about. So it had significant impact. It's just that we just have to be more aware of this tiny little secret so-called small ripple, but the ripple can have significant big waves in everything because an idea. It's all about the idea in the end. So I just want to add, it's not so much a question, it's just adding to the value what you do in there, Paul. What we
I'm
do.
also thinking a little closer to home, even in your own publication, I'm thinking of how this was distributed. This is this incredible book-length essay, series of essays by Nora Khan that Brooklyn Rail published that I remember talking with Nora about this, how excited I was to see that this was slipped inside the Brooklyn Rail and available in piles around New York City. So it was possible to just sort of like think you're getting one publication and then secretly like receive another one as it slips out of the newspaper, and how just what a beautiful gesture that is for the commodity to be circulating in a kind of unexpected way. Like
I agree, and I still value print. Everything had to be print for me in archives. So we can do both, but print to me is very important when you get your hand on it. I think the attitude for the writer perspective also is not the same for the one who write for the web, you know? So that's another thing, but don't have the question because you answer everything. So,
I'm looking at all in the chat. There's so much in the chat. My goodness.
I know, I was looking through too. I wish we had time to talk to everybody.
Yeah, and in response to B, yes, it was also translated into Spanish and published there. So we do have more questions. I'll keep it moving.
Yeah, another good one. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Glenys, I'm going to unmute you next. You had a question about what we were talking about with the porous. You are
let's
live.
see.
Oh,
Okay,
goodness.
let me.
Oh my goodness.
Hey! Oh my God! How are you?
Great.
This has been so interesting. My question is: can a porous space be a traveling space, knowing that the collective of all this amazing art, especially during this COVID-19, is different translated between one space to another space and different genders and different spectrum of society. So can this be a traveling space somewhere, somehow?
A traveling space? Is that what you said?
Yes, yes.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, why not? Well, I'm thinking about, this is interesting. It reminds me of a project that I'm starting to work on with Image Text Ithaca, which is this incredible program that runs out of Ithaca College, and there may even be some people on this call. Oh, there's Glenys. Hi, Glenys.
Yes. Hi.
Good to see you. And we're talking about, it's really just a bare sketch of an idea right now, but the idea of if we are not able to be in public space for a thesis exhibition that they were planning for this summer, to make a publication, probably a newsprint one, that could be sent and delivered and potentially put up in domestic spaces as the exhibition or as a form of exhibition. So there are probably so many other examples of how we could blur some of these lines between a space and a publication, and how these things can travel, what mobility means in these situations.
I could also see them as billboards.
Billboard.
I mean, yeah, I could also see them as billboards. It's like, I don't know, it is an amazing collective of work that it should be like expanded even, internationally. It's very much interesting, just visually engaging, very much, you can feel the amount of work it is visually, coming from a moment in life that is not finished, and we don't know when it's going to be finished, and how this is going to affect the life of many, many people and all of us at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Billboard. This is one of our students, one of our seniors here at RISD is doing this project right now. It's ongoing right now.
That's very cool.
It's called Post Contact, and this is actually a space that they have created outside their house, permission from the landlord, and this is an exhibition space that's just out on the street in a sort of quiet suburban street here in Providence. And he's using this as a place for printing artwork and putting it out there in public space. So again, a non-traditional way of making a connection back to this idea of attunement, or what are new ways that we can connect and gather ourselves and work today that maybe might actually look kind of obvious, but just haven't been done before.
Thank you.
It's also interesting, you mentioned when is this going to be finished? And I know that you were kind of talking, Glenny's, sorry if I mispronounced it, about this idea of when is it going to be finished. I know you were talking about the virus, but also thinking about porosity as allowing space for something to be unfinished, to be ongoing, to be continuous.
That's what I was gonna that was what I was making the connection of, like an unfinished project for me right now seems to be the ideal project.
Yeah,
because it's thinking of the notion like, okay, whether I want it to be finished, whether I enjoy being at home, which I never was able to be before, whether I from my commodity of my space, where can I just be connected with the whole world? And that notion of unfinished finish, I think, is a great way to put it.
Yeah, and again, it's sort of like another binary, like Paul and I were talking about earlier, that maybe we need to dismantle and find space in. I also work with artists on building their archives, and the question that often comes up when I'm working with artists is asking, how do they know when a work is finished? How do they categorize unfinished work? So this idea of finished and unfinished binary is really interesting to me.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Our next question will be from our art director, Mike Tully. Mike, I will unmute you now.
Hey, everyone. Hey, Paul.
Hello.
Thanks for sharing everything today, and thanks, Megan, for leading this. So I have a question for you. So I teach at Parsons, and I teach typography to design students, but I really enjoyed what you wrote about engaged pedagogy and urgent craft. And I was just curious what your thoughts are on kind of like encouraging students to challenge traditional visual methodologies in their work, instead of kind of looking for the permission of like, is this good, is this bad, that sort of thing that students sometimes do, which are kind of just false dichotomies anyways. And I'm also curious what you think about nurturing like community, or like what you were talking about, nurturing care in that environment of the classroom.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks. Pedagogy and my teaching is a huge part of my practice, which I haven't really talked about today, but it's a space and a place where I get to also like experiment with these ideas and try and test them out and learn from students about these ideas. So engaged pedagogy, which, you know, is coming from bell hooks, and this idea of really creating a space where you're questioning the authority that you bring into the room, where you are where I try to decenter myself in that learning space is really hard to do, because the institutions and the structures that we teach, that you and I teach in, and any of us in any kind of art and design schools are not really set up that way. You know, they're set up to uphold and support those traditional ideas of success that we talk about, those ideas of success that prepare one to go and get a high-paying job, or to get any job for that matter, and they reward that kind of success as well in different ways. So trying to make a space within an institution like that where you are where students are giving themselves the permission to experiment, to fail, to try something, to be vulnerable, to consider the others in the room as a community, not as competitors, is really a challenge. It's really difficult. It's something that I'm actively trying to do in my teaching. I got to experiment a little bit more with this with an elective I taught last year called Urgency Lab, where this became this, meaning like this topic, this idea, these ideas really became the focus of that class, and the class was in it with me, and we were all like vocalizing these questions and aware of them and trying to make work together in new ways. And it really became a class about how to collaborate and how to work collectively. yeah, so it's an ongoing thing. It's something I'm not really an expert in or that good at yet, but it's something I'm trying to bring into everything I do at school. Oh, one more thing about engaged pedagogy is, and this space that I'm in, the Queer.Archive.Work space, is trying, I'm also, again, as this organization, you know, begins to develop, I want to try to take these ideas about engaged pedagogy simultaneously working on them within the school, away from the school. And to go back to Juliet's question about who participates, who has access, how does a tool like a risograph machine become an empowering resource for someone maybe who's never even heard of the printer before? These are the questions I'm interested in. That's very, very different from, you know, our typical students at RISD who you know, who graduate well versed in these ideas and how to take advantage of them and use them productively.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Are we done, Sophia, or are we going to keep going?
Well, I think we're done. I mean, I know there's so much more we could go into in this conversation, but we did make it through our questions today. And unless you'd like to call on a friend in the crowd to join the conversation, we can end with our traditional poem, and then after that we do enable people to pipe up and say goodbye. So maybe you could see friends on the way out.
Good. So yeah, go for it with the poem.
Oh, before we do the poem, I just want to thank you again, Paul. This has been so great, and I just knew that you would have so much to offer to the Rhode community, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
It's been great to meet you and to learn so much about what you do. So as luck would have it, Mike Tully is actually our poet today, who asked our last question. So I will hand over from Mike for the poem.
Well, thanks, Sophia. Yeah, and thanks again, Paul. Thanks, Megan. This was a really wonderful conversation to listen to today. And thanks for everyone who asked good questions. So I picked a poem from this book called, well, you can't really see it, but it's called Backpacking in the Hereafter by MC Richards, who was a student and affiliated with the Black Mountain Art College. This poem is called Concerts of Space, for Lucy Reed. I was looking at a friend's bookshelf this morning, and I thought I saw a book with the title Concerts of Space, and my heart leapt. What a poetic title, I exclaimed, hearing music of the spheres and heavenly harmonies, and then my gaze lengthened and the words read, Concepts of Space. Never mind, I said to myself, and perhaps aloud. I shall write a poem and call it Concerts of Space, and it shall be for Lucy Reed, and the cup and saucer she made and gave to me on Sunday. Your pots are decisions, Lucy Reed, decisions, forms, and emblems, mots. No, they are pots of clay, timbers of darkness and light, suffered through, come safely through. Your hands, Lucy Reed, conduct them through the fire, Concerts of Space.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here, and especially to Paul and Megan for such a beautiful conversation. We hold these events every day at 1 p.m. and tomorrow we have the wonderful Anne Waldman joining us. So you can use the same link over and over again, or you can sign up on Eventbrite. And if people would like to say goodbye on their way out, you are now able to unmute yourselves to do that.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Paul. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Glennies.
Bye.
Wonderful. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.
Really good.
Thanks,
David.
David.
Thank you.
Hey, Brad. Good to see you.
Megan.
Hey, Brad.
Hey, hey, Brad.
Hey, Charlie. Good to see you too. Paul, thank you. Megan, thank you. This was awesome.
Hi, Yassi.
Okay, Holland. Hi, Edwin.
Hey, Yassi.
Hi. Thanks, Paul.
So nice to suddenly see all these.
Jason. Good to
no
see
idea.
you.
Nice to see all the faces fly by.